Hello? 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 Cool. I think it works. We will see.
Ready to go? Wait, I'm going to intro you first.
I was just
You just do everything you need to do. You just there.
Yeah, Justin did
This is beautiful.
I love it.
Yeah, I think I can do it.
It is
It's
like,
so cozy.
it is like not the first 14 years, but 17 years of my life. At least 7.
It's incredible that you brought this.
Are you going to tell people a little about it?
I will.
Your childhood bedroom?
It's your,
And that mine is hung over the window of my childhood bedroom right now.
I'm just going to say what it is, and then you're going to tell me.
Here.
For me, or moi? I'm going to start.
Yeah. And you just put this right here.
Yeah.
We're live.
The back door open.
It can always be closed.
Letter is what your mother tells you to put on her shoes. Thank you so much.
I just wanted to just call it out.
No, I appreciate that.
Tell me when.
You're good?
Start?
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I am here to introduce Rachel Kushner. I don't think this is working at all, this mic. Hello.
It's working.
It's working. Rachel Kushner, it's a pleasure to have Rachel here. This is my childhood sheet from my bed of very key, like 8 key years of my childhood, and it's here for a reason, but I'll leave you in suspense for a minute. Rachel Kushner is a product of the Northwest and the Bay Area of Berkeley in California, of Latin American political history, and a fascination with motorcycles, bartending, clubs, music, and cars. She's become one of the literary world's leading figures with work that interrogates the link between the political and the fictional, the craft work of fiction, the invention of fiction. In my class last week, we had a hearty discussion on whether Rachel Kushner was a moralist or an aesthete, and whether this old-fashioned opposition was even applicable in our world. The aesthete is an inventor of plots, of characters, of metaphors, and a synthesizer, one who creates artless juxtapositions, also artful, that structure their work. The moralist assesses and judges, and this moral equation becomes the backbone of their work. It's a cliche to say that the aesthete is more concerned with form and the moralist with content, but let's let that hang in the air for a minute. It has nothing to do with the sheet. Rachel's work evinces a sustained commitment to progressive radicalism and the figure of the revolutionary. The commitment is never overt, but imbricated in the web of first and third person narrators, truthful and unreliable, deceptive even. Creation Lake, her new book, has a fugue-like plot and is located in the landscape of ecological disaster, ecological hope, and ecological radicalism or even terrorism. Some call it a spy novel, others call it a subversion of the spy novel. At its core is the interrogation of the narrator, both as a figure in the world and as a figure in the novel. Every year I remind my students that the key to understanding narrative is to understand the elusive and submerged role of the narrator. Is the truth immediately legible, or is it an indeterminate contested territory, or is it buried and elusive and available for skilled excavation? It's my pleasure to welcome Rachel Kushner and to work together at the Dig.
Thank you, Matthias. Where do I put this? Just like here? Okay. So, I have to see myself while I do this. It's like being at home. It's like being at home on Zoom, where you could kind of pretend that you're not like, I mean, who knew that we'd all be looking in the mirror while trying to have conversations? It's funny. Okay, well, at least my glass tint does match these sheets, which I didn't know were going to be behind me until I arrived here, and I thank Matthias for having me to his class. It's really an honor to have people read your work, and people who are writers themselves, peers, to talk about, like kind of try to, I mean, interrogate's the wrong word, but it's like sort of give language to what it is we're doing and the effects of what we do, and then talking about it in real time with people who've read it. So I arrived and Matthias had the sheet in his hand. So I also had this childhood sheet on my bed growing up, and the reason is my grandfather worked as a screen printer, and he made these sheets. So I mean, he actually, it's a complicated story. I'm not fresh on the details. I had written an article about it, that he worked with this workshop of design studios in New York City that were all owned and run by Black women working with printers from West Africa to make these sheets, and they got this funding for it. And he was the one who got to print them, and he was incredibly proud of it. And I grew up sleeping on these sheets. And then Matthias told me that he, in fact, had the same sheets. And my mother still has this sheet over the window in my room, like she never put up a curtain. So it just has a bed sheet over the window. And I just slept there 2 weeks ago with the light coming through from this. So it's like these things that you grow up with, you think they have something to do with you. And it doesn't matter that they're replicated for other people. That doesn't in any way bleed away their specificity for you. I don't know. I think about that sometimes. We've all had these jobs when we were younger. Like I worked all through high school. I worked at Baskin Robbins. And then in my young adulthood, I worked at International House of Pancakes, which is rebranded more, like stepping on my coat, rebranded more recently to IHOP. But I went back to the IHOP where I'd worked. I was actually with my mother in Asheville, North Carolina, and she said, like, let's go into, your alma mater, the IHOP. And I thought, well, what's the point? It's a chain. They all look the same. But she insisted, and she was absolutely right. It doesn't matter that it's replicated. It still has specificity. And I was like plunged into sense memory going in there. It was quite amazing. This is like a little more niche than IHOP, but no less evocative for two people in this room. All right, thanks for coming. I think Michael's here. I haven't seen you in a long time. Hi. All right, so I'm going to just read some like scattered parts from my book, starting with the opening. You guys can hear, right? I think I'm just like voice, not amplified. Neanderthals were prone to depression, he said. He said they were prone to addiction too, and especially smoking. Although it was likely, he said, that these noble and mysterious Tals, as he sometimes referred to the Neanderthals, extracted nicotine from the tobacco plant by a cruder method, such as by chewing its leaves. Before that critical point of inflection in the history of the world, when the first man touched the first tobacco leaf to the first fire. Reading this part of Bruno's email, scanning from man to touch to leaf to fire, I pictured a 1950s greaser in a white t-shirt and black leather jacket as he touches a lit match to the tip of his Camel cigarette and inhales. The greaser leans against a wall because that is what greasers do. They lean and loiter, and then he exhales. Bruno Lacombe told Pascal in these emails I was secretly reading that the Neanderthals had very large brains, or at least their skulls were very large, and we can safely infer that their skulls were likely filled, Bruno said, with brains. He talked about the impressive size of a Tal's brain case using modern metaphors, comparing them to motorcycle engines, which were also measured, he noted, for their displacement. Of all the human-like species who stood up on 2 feet, who roamed the earth for the last 1 million years, Bruno said that the Neanderthal's brain case was way out in front at a whopping 1,800 cubic centimeters. I pictured a king of the road way out in front. I saw his leather vest, his big gut, legs extended, engineer's boots resting on roomy chrome forward-mounted foot pegs. His chopper is fitted with ape hangers that he can barely reach, and which he pretends are not making his arms tired, are not causing terrible shooting pains to his lumbar region. We know from their skulls, Bruno said, that Neanderthals had enormous faces. I pictured Joan Crawford, that scale of face, dramatic, brutal, compelling. And thereafter, in the Natural History Museum in my mind, the one I was creating as I read Bruno's emails, its dioramas populated by figures in loincloths with yellow teeth and matted hair. All these ancient people Bruno described, the men too, they all had Joan Crawford's face. They had her fair skin and her flaming red hair. A propensity for red hair, Bruno said, had been identified as a genetic trait of the Tal as scientific advancements in gene mapping were made. And beyond such work, such proof, Bruno said, we might employ our natural intuition to suppose that, like typical redheads, the Neanderthals' emotions were strong and acute, spanning the heights and depths. A few more things, Bruno wrote to Pascal, that we now know about Neanderthals. They were good at math. They did not enjoy crowds. They had strong stomachs and were not especially prone to ulcers, but their diet of constant barbecue did its damage as it would to any gut. They were extra vulnerable to tooth decay and gum disease, and they had overdeveloped jaws, wonderfully capable of chewing gristle and cartilage, but inefficient for softer fare, a jaw that was overkill. Bruno described the jaw of the Neanderthal as a feature of pathos for its overdevelopment, the burden of a square jaw. He talked about sunk costs as if the body were a capital investment, a fixed investment, the parts of the body like machines bolted to a factory floor, equipment that had been purchased and could not be resold. The Neanderthal jaw was a sunk cost. Still, the Tal's heavy bones and sturdy heat-conserving build were to be admired, Bruno said, especially compared to the breadstick limbs of modern man, Homo sapiens sapien. Bruno did not say breadstick, but since I was translating as he was writing these emails in French, I drew from the full breadth of English a wildly superior language and my native tongue. Usually people laugh at that part. The Tals survive, unless you just simply agree and think English is a wildly superior language. The tiles survived cold very well, he said, if not the eons, or so the story about them goes. A story that we must complicate, he said, if we are to know the truth about the ancient past, if we are to glimpse the truth about this world now, and how to live in it, how to occupy the present, and where to go tomorrow. My own tomorrow was thoroughly planned out. I would be meeting Pascal Balmy, leader of Le Moulin, to whom these emails from Bruno were written. And I didn't need the Neanderthal's help on where to go. Pascal Balmy said to go to the Café de la Route on the main square in the little village of Vendôme at 1 p.m., and that was where I would be. All right, so that's the opening. And I'll just skip ahead to, so the narrator, for those who have not read the book or weren't in Mateus's class, the narrator is an American woman who has been hired to infiltrate a group of leftist activists who've decamped from Paris to a rural outpost in south central western France. And, this is not autofiction, it's fiction. She's not me. And she doesn't have any sympathy for the social project of the people that she's traveling to infiltrate. Quite the opposite. Her raison d'etre among them is to get them raided by the police. In this part of the book, she is on her way there. It had been a long and tedious journey from Marseille to the Dubois place, 8 hours. I made a lot of stops to try to keep things interesting. Then again, the trip might have been 8 hours because I was doing that. I was on toll roads, pulling over to drink regional wines in highway travel centers, franchised and generic, with food steaming under orange heat lamps, each of these travel centers offering local products. Lavender oils, for instance, always made at monasteries, as if the monks worshipped lavender instead of God. Or dried truffles, mustards, and glass jars of jellied meats that look like cat food, or which French people call a terrine and eat as if it were not cat food. It all gets mixed up in your stomach anyhow, I heard no one say, as people lined up to buy this stuff. I sampled these wines from the vantage of plastic seating overlooking fuel pump and highway. I sipped rosé from the Luberon at a clumsily air-conditioned monop off the A55, a chaotic place where children screeched and a haggard woman dragged a dirty mop over the floor. The rosé was delicate and fruity, crisp as ironed linen. I found a pêche Armand from the oldest vintner in Bergerac at the L'Arche Cafeteria on the autoroute A7, a wine that was woody with notes of ambergris and laurel and maybe dried apricot. I enjoyed a white Bordeaux of Medoc provenance en plein air at a roadside fuel stop where a trucker farted loudly while paying for his diesel at the automatic pump, the loose valves of his truck, like his own loose valves, clattering away. This white Bordeaux is smooth as a silk garment in a virgin's trousseau. I could have been a little buzzed by this point 5 hours into my drive. This cold, dry white wine sent me dreaming about a world where all my clothes were white and I slept on white sheets and would never be traded for a dowry or violated by rough and unworthy men or forced to drink anything less than the finest French wines of the smallest and oldest and most esteemed appellations. And in a way, I could say that I was living that life right here at this gas station. At least in spirit I was. I care about fine wine, but not about food, and because the terrine is efficient, comes in its own container, and can be consumed unheated, I stole 2 jars of it from one of these travel centers, the weight of the jars giving a new tug to the leather straps of my handbag as I purchased my wine. It wasn't that I believed the wine I bought was payment enough for my jars of human cat food. Stealing is a way to stop time. Also, it refocuses the mind, the senses, if they become dulled, for instance, by drinking. Stealing puts reality into sharper relief. You're in a highway travel center, people in a great flux and flow, coming and going and knowing and choosing. The cashier's in a fugue state of next and next and next. And in order to locate the precise moment when you can take unseen, you slow it all down. You make time stop. You insert into reality what composers call a fermata, and while time is stopped, you put something in your bag. In this way, I test my fitness. I test my ability to see. I gauge what other people see and also what they fail to see. I am a better driver after a few drinks, more focused. Instead of trying to read my phone or put on lipstick, after several glasses of these regional wines, I faced forward and held the wheel with both hands. Drink lulled me into doing only what I was supposed to, drive the car. Except that I decided toll roads were going to put me to sleep, so I opted for a scenic route on secondary roads. I got lost winding through the Massif Central and its gear-grinding turns. Sure, I was reckless with the clutch, but it's hard for me to feel that rental cars have value. This one, a small hatchback Skoda, cost €8 a day. The Skoda was clean diesel, an oxymoron that was a metaphor for something, but I didn't know what. Clean diesel, clean coal. Add the word clean, and boom, it's clean. My navigation was off, and the scenic route took me way too scenically over a summit. I passed a tower on a cliff, its top edges eaten away like a sugar cone. At that point, when the ice cream is gone, and the child is contractually obliged to take bites of its tasteless container. God damn it, I said. These breathtaking vistas were unappealing because they confirmed I was lost. I wanted only an indication by this point that I was headed northwest toward the city of Boulier. I saw no signs for Boulier. I was in remote forested highlands. I pulled off at the top of a summit into an unpaved lot adjacent to a building, some kind of mountain inn, hoping for directions. The inn was closed. Its windows were boarded. It had just rained up here, and the air was damp and warm and close, like human breath. The lot was crisscrossed with patterned ruts from truck tires. A mist hung in the branches of the low trees beyond the lot, as if a cloud had descended on this mountain and left its ragged parts among the woods. It felt like a place of aftermath where something had happened. I peed in the wooded area beyond the open lot. While squatting, I encountered a pair of women's day-glow orange underpants snagged in the bushes at eye level. This did not seem odd. Truck ruts and panties snagged on a bush. That is Europe. The real Europe is not a posh cafe on the Rue de Rivoli with gilded frescoes and little pots of famous hot chocolate. That's a conception of Europe cherished by certain Parisians and as imaginary as the pastoral scenes in the frescoes on the walls of the posh cafe. The real Europe is a borderless supply of network and transport. It is shrink-wrapped pallets, a borderless network of supply and transport. It is shrink-wrapped pallets of super-pasteurized milk or powdered Nesquik or semiconductors. The real Europe is highways and nuclear power plants. It is windowless distribution warehouses where unseen men, Polish, Moldovan, Macedonian, back up their empty trucks and load goods that they will move through a giant grid called Europe, a Texas-sized parcel of which is called France. These men will ignore weight regulations on their loads and safety inspections on their brakes. They will text someone at home in their own language, listen to pop music in English, and get their needs met locally in empty lots on mountain passes. The only mystery is where they find the women for these occasions, but even that isn't so hard to imagine. A girl or woman fallen on hard times, not French and without EU documents, stuck in a rural outpost, picking her way out to the main road in impractical high-heeled shoes, aloe in her purse for rapid-fire handjobs. She's left her underwear in these woods. Big deal. The panties hanging on a bush in front of my face are a package of 3 for €5 at Carrefour. They're like Kleenex. You sweat or leak or bleed into them and then toss them on a bush or in the trash, or you flush them and clog the plumbing, someone else's plumbing, ideally. I had been drinking, as I said, and I had to go. I was making beer, as a Moldovan trucker might put it. A foaming reservoir filled its makeshift banks on the ground over which I squatted, and then it overflowed those banks, streaming like advanced troops sent downhill on a scouting mission. I was still peeing and watching my pee make its way down the hill when I heard footsteps. I startled. Was someone here? So, that's enough of her. The other storyteller in the book, for those who haven't read it, is named Bruno Lacombe, and in a way, he's the central character, more than she is. He's the elder for this group of young people who formed this commune that they call the Mill, Le Moulin, that she's on her way to, and those passages I read. And he is somebody I see as a kind of refugee of the long 20th century who was very shaped by May of 1968 and the kind of utopian promise in the idea of urban revolt, and then, like many of his generation, became disillusioned and felt that the factory worker in cities was not like truly the revolutionary subject. And in France, especially, a lot of these people ended up moving to the countryside, thinking the peasantry is the site of the real deep vein of resistance in France. And this, was the 1970s, and a lot of people did that, Bruno among them. And then, for one reason or another, it didn't work out, whether through disillusionment, a discovery that maybe the local farmers didn't have the same values and goals that they did. Farming's also very difficult, and if you come from a city, you might not be conditioned to learn to do that kind of difficult physical labor. For Bruno, he goes to the countryside. He has a daughter who dies in an accident on a tractor. All these things happen to him. His life is full of life that he shares in the book with the reader through Sadie, because he's writing these kind of sermons to the group, and has at this point left society and decided that, unlike many of his generational peers who are still sort of in this modality of messianic waiting for the revolution to come, Bruno has decided that capitalism is very supple and self-expanding, almost like the universe, and that it cannot be dismantled and probably won't be dismantled, especially not in his own lifetime. He's in his 80s. And but he himself has not given up hope, and instead has turned the revolution inward and has this sort of abstract idea about renovating consciousness. And in order to do that, he's looked to the very deep past, to prehistoric times, and he lives in a cave, but is writing these long emails at the computer terminal in the farmhouse that is his, where his daughter lives. And Sadie has cracked into his email in order to find evidence that he's guiding the young people in plans of sabotage. And instead, she finds something else, which is his yearnings and his kind of mythifying concerning Neanderthals and whether or not they smoked. And so this is Bruno. He'd been in these caves 12 years now, he said, and still he had not gotten to any definable end. The cavern's design instead calling into question the whole concept of an end. Here on Earth is another Earth, he said, a different reality, no less real. It has different rules. You won't understand any of this from me telling you about it. You might even dismiss what I say. For 9/10 of human time on Earth, people went underground. Their symbolic world was formed in part by their activities in caves, by modalities and visions that darkness promised. Then this all ceased. The underground world was lost to us. The industrial uses of the earth, the digging, fracking, tunneling, are mere plunder and do not count, Bruno said. Modern people who build bomb shelters planning to survive some version of apocalypse also do not count, he said. Yes, they go underground, but not in mind of a human continuum, a community. They think I'll be the clever one, the one who survives mass death. But why would you want to survive mass death? What would be the purpose of life if life were reduced to a handful of armed pessimists, hoarding canned foods and fearing each other? In a bunker, you cannot hear the human community in the earth, the deep cistern of voices, the lake of our creation. In my cave, he said, under my cave, welling up from deeper passages, I hear so many things, not just the drip of water. I hear voices, people talking. Sometimes it's in French, sometimes Occitan or older languages of the older tongues of the Languedoc. Many languages I do not recognize, sounds of which I cannot understand a word. But I know that what I hear is humans. It is human talk. Did we always have language? We don't know the answer to this. Linguists try to chart what they call glottochronologies. They picture language like a tree with a trunk, the first language at the base of the trunk being simple and common, what some call nostratic. This is a fantasy, but who can refute them? They cannot escape the chains of their telos, the sad idea that they are the logical outcome, the advanced form of human speech. They never imagine that if language is a tree, they must look not at its trunk, but at its roots, which, like a tree's roots, might form an upside-down chandelier, reaching and spreading deep into the dark beyond. But most people are unable to grasp how far down the physical world goes, and they would not know that voices are stored in its depths. It is hard to explain, he said. You would have to have lived as I live, done what I've done, learned what I've learned, in order to hear what I hear. You would need a different mind, he said. When you live underground, among the things you discover is that you're in a world richly peopled, occupied by legions. Homo erectus, who stood up and cooked, Bruno said, he is here. Homo neanderthalensis, who huddled modestly and dreamed expansively, here. Homo sapien, gone into the caves to paint, to render his capture with extra legs, extra horns, so that these beasts canted and ran over cave wall or butted head, clashed and fought, all in the light of a torch, H. Sapien's underground cinema house. That resourceful and ruinous forebear of ours, he is here. Cathars and other heretics, the few not slaughtered, gone deep, living in darkness, yes, present. Calgo, after the war of 1594, hiding to survive, surviving in secret, here. Cavers, 19th century men and boys, killed by curiosity, fallen in, unable to make their way out, here. The partisans, men of my own boyhood, who retreated underground to hide from rampaging Germans, they too are here. For a long time, he said, you cannot tune in. Then you might sense a current or buzz of energy. This sound transforms the more time you spend in caves. It becomes voices. You hear these voices but are unable to isolate them. It takes years to learn how to listen, to differentiate, to adjust your inner tuner to a position on the atemporal bandwidth of the underground world. Remember shortwave transmission, he asked them. Probably you don't, he answered. Tuning into shortwave programming used to be an art, Bruno said. Depending on the bandwidth, it worked best at night. There was a book, he said, that listed program by calendar schedule and megahertz. You learned to listen for where to put the dial in order to hear a Bulgarian choir or news from Senegal or Venezuela's Radio Juventud. Shortwave is real, of course, he said. It is also a metaphor. I bring it up not to reminisce over dead technologies, but to help you understand. Cave frequencies, he said, are not 3 to 30 megahertz. Cave bandwidth crosses moments, eras, epochs, eons. You have to learn to get inside the monophony, to tease it apart. Eventually, you encounter an extraordinary polyphony. You begin to sort, to filter. You hear whispers, laughter, murmurs, pleas. There's a feeling that everyone is here. A wonderful feeling, I should add, because suddenly you realize how alone we have been, how isolated, to be trapped, stuck in calendar time and cut off from everyone who came before us. I never want to be that alone again, he said. And that's the end of my reading. Thanks. It's hard to know what to read. I'm sure the writers in the room, like you want to do that one thing that is the metonym for the whole book, but it doesn't exist. So, or the desire to do that is based on a sort of a fantasy or a false supposition that there is one part that can create the whole, but it's only the whole that does the whole. So I spared you me standing here reading 416 pages to you. But those are just small bits and pieces, And I understand that I'm meant to entertain questions if anyone has them. Yeah, no, I'm happy to answer any question or talk. Thank you.
The piece, the little passage about the real Europe, right, is a distribution network.
Yeah.
I remember, and I can't remember where, but I remember reading a review that thought that didn't understand.
Oh yeah, that happened a couple times.
That Sadie is like an idiot, right? She's an articulate idiot, right? But she's an idiot.
She thinks she's a lot smarter than she is.
Yeah. And I don't think anyone in the book would use the word idiot for her, right? I'm adding that word. But I'm very curious because I was also listening to some of Bruno, who's wild. He's speculative. He speculates.
He is.
And as the kind of the core storyteller, the real storyteller, it's an interesting contrast, right? Because he speculates in a very different way than she invents.
It's true. No, I mean, right. Do you want to say more, or should I?
I wanted to ask you about constructing these. I want to ask you about them both as narrators and how, because I think you're very crafty at the narrator. I think it's one of your fundamental skills that you have,
Thanks.
Right? And you think through the power of this. It's sometimes it's a person, right? But in the third person, it's not. It's an entity, right? But this figure who has incredible powers within those pages, and you marshal them in these kind of very purposeful and playful ways. So your play with the narrator and your kind of what you call on them to do.
Those are wonderful observations and so acute. Thank you. So a few different things I could say. That passage about the real Europe. I mean, I sometimes read reviews. I sometimes don't. It depends on the review. Like if I think I can learn something from it, then I might read it. If I get the feeling that the critic has sort of taken seriously the terms of what I was trying to make, and that's not always the case. And sometimes somebody else will say like, you're not really in it. There's nothing here to engage with. Like, just don't bother. But and it can go either way. I mean, it can go in both directions. I would say with that, like a review can be incredibly complimentary, and I'm also not going to learn anything. And there's not much to, I'm happy that it's there, but what are you going to learn from reading about it? And it's really kind of sometimes where people disagree with you that. It's like it's interesting to see what it is that they're reacting to. And I don't know if this is a review that you meant. There was one in the New Yorker that it was like.
Sounds like I read the New Yorker.
Yeah, I mean that I got a lot of really good reviews, but that review was quite negative. And I got the feeling that she thought that the book was sort of meant to outsmart the reader, and she wanted to sort of reestablish that she wasn't falling for it. But I really don't write to outsmart other people at all. I mean, it's so much more of an earnest engagement for me. Like Bruno is a lunatic, but he's like my lunatic, and he was a really reparative fantasy for me, like soul work, writing the book. Like I was talking to students today, having having a character who can acknowledge that we're careening off a cliff in a driverless car and kind of sort of use his mind and his sense of play and mythifying to find some solution to that was quite healing for me. But in any case, that part about the real Europe, there is no one real thing. Like, actually, I was saying that I'm always looking for the passage of the book that will magically reproduce all the different discordant, textures of the book itself. Doesn't exist. There's also no one real Europe. So for any narrator to claim that the real Europe is nuclear power plants, and for a critic to go like, that's not the real Europe, is to sort of miss the point that this narrator, A, is drunk, B, is driving, C, sees herself as smarter than she really is, and also is somebody who comforts herself with brittle arguments about other people's romantic illusions because she's on her way to try to destroy a utopian project. And so on her way there, she says, but there already is nothing to protect because what you have is the EU, which builds these auto routes, and what you have is supply and transport, and what you have is a subaltern class of truck drivers from the Balkans who do this and do that. And then what you also have is the invisible mist of violence that, I'm sorry, every woman everywhere can see everywhere she goes. So she's just borrowing a little bit from me there. It's me you encounter the panties on the bush at an abandoned truck stop. And what else do you imagine than that they indicate something? They're almost there to let you know that violence has taken place, whether today or yesterday or 3 months ago or whatever. So she's riffing on some of that. But one funny thing is interesting to me is that people have been upset about that passage because it's like I'm not on Twitter, but it got reproduced on Twitter as though it were something I wrote, like I was making declarations about what the real Europe is. And it concerns me only because I want people to still be able to read novels as fiction where you read the whole thing and, it's about this oscillation between these two lunatics, Sadie, who's a lunatic in a completely different way than Bruno is lunatic, and then also what passes between them and how she transforms maybe over the course of the book or doesn't, or whether or not her illusions carry her to the end. How long is this thing going to last with her sense of herself, not noticing that she drinks heavily and dumps her trash everywhere and treats other people as though she's never going to have to face them again, like what she says about herself, that she has no real identifying characteristics. She's good looking, but in a really banal way. So that after she's screwed people over, they go like, oh yeah, well, what did she look like? She says, I look like what white women are supposed to look like brown hair. Oh, she had kind of even features, It's like nobody can really describe her. In any case, the passage has to be taken sort of in some kind of context because it's not me making a declaration, and I would never try, because Europe is many different things combined. But so there'd been a sort of thing about that passage, and then I was in Edinburgh on my book tour, doing an event at a bookstore, and I invited to be in conversation with me this sheep herder. He's a farmer and a writer in England named James Rebanks. Really, really interesting guy. I love his books. And he drove down from his farm to do the event with me, and then left that night and got home at 3 a.m. And I'd never met him, but I know from I could tell from his work that we would connect. And there had just been this brouhaha about that passage, and he said, would you read that passage about the real Europe? And I was like, people are so scandalized by it, they think it's me. And I didn't even really want to explain that to him. And I said, well, what do you see in that passage? And he said, being a farmer and trying to make a living and dealing with the industrial incursions, even into the most protected sphere for a farmer like me, who's doing small batch sheep herding and rewilding portions of my farm. He's like, what I deal with feels like the auto route and the nuclear power plant are passing directly through my farm. And so he was like on her side of it. He was saying that is the real Europe, because that's what we've had to deal with. I mean, of course, the UK is no longer part of the EU, and I doubt he voted Brexit, but he's sort of talking about an inability to escape infrastructure and the larger aspects of state infrastructure that might be invisible to people who simply buy food in a grocery store. And so he really wanted that part in there because, you know, he's coming from a locality where you produce food and feels like people are not aware of, and that there's this weird duality where it's either the hot chocolate at Angelina on the Place de la Concorde or it's supply and transport, when in fact it's neither and both and many other things besides. Yeah. James, and then, wait, Nick, yes, so sorry, okay.
I'm curious about how you go about actually creating Sadie and Bruno. How do they, when you're writing, how do they grow into these characters? And I was really taken by Bruno. I wanted to go down on the caves with him and learn from him. And Sadie, I wanted to punch in the nose.
Yeah.
And so you both of those characters I'm strongly connected to in such different ways, and they're so different but they come out of your head. So how do you construct that? How do they grow? How do you find out who they are?
It's a great question, and I don't know, you know, Bruno makes myths. I feel like the writer writes a novel and then maybe makes myths, because you write this thing and part of the process of making it is sort of remains mysterious, but you have to come up with this supplemental language, you know, to talk about what you did. And so the first answer is I don't really know, but the second is, like, just in terms of piece by piece, I was telling the students this afternoon, like when I first wrote those first two lines that Neanderthals were prone to depression, that had stuck in my head because of something that I had read, and I just knew that it would be how my character would start the book, because it has to do with sympathies and the underdog. You know, I mean, when I was growing up, the term Neanderthal was used in a derogatory manner, and I'm always for the underdog. So it's like this idea that there's, you know, multiple life forms in Africa and Asia and Europe that aren't with us today, and it's like, what? It's because they just couldn't hack it? It just didn't make sense to me. So I made him someone who sort of speculates and maybe fantasizes that those people who were too weak to hack it also had like some beautiful qualities, like they were too tender for this world or something, you know? I mean, he starts to question some of that by the end of the book, because it's a little arch and there's so many things we don't know at all about human migration. But he sort of, the Neanderthal becomes for him like his beautiful loser. And he says, you know, oh, they had these large brains, you know, large skulls, you know, presumably filled with brains, and slept 12 hours a night. And then I was thinking that for Bruno, sleep is a sort of revolutionary activity. I mean, that was partly because I had just met Alexander Kluge, and I said, how do you look so incredible? And he's in his 90s, and he said, I sleep 12 hours a night. And I thought, you know, Kluge's been doing the good work all these years, and like maybe sleep is revolutionary. And there's this idea that the longer you sleep, the more you dream, like in an evolutionary sense. And the more you dream, the more like synaptic connections your brain builds. And so it's like a good feedback loop. And so Bruno is just thinking into that. And I guess I have been reading a lot of stuff about prehistory and going to this part of France, you know, every year and walking on paths that have been walked on by people continuously for 500,000 years. And I do feel that you can feel that in places.
Also, Remy worked in caves, and
Right.
you say that in another, which I thought is interesting to bring that into this character.
Well, right. The thing is, like, I don't really, I mean, I've gone into the tourist caves where you can go and see paintings by Cro-Magnon, you know, like colored cave paintings on the walls by people like 25 to 28,000 years ago. But I haven't been, like, some of what Bruno does is it goes way underground, and that would make me claustrophobic. My son has started going underground into caverns and caves in France starting when he was 7, and then the last 2 years worked as a camp counselor where he took children into caves as a caving guide, and they go way underground. Like sometimes they go a mile underground. And I remember him telling me when he was much younger about going into a cave that had a ceiling as tall as a cathedral, like Notre Dame. He said it was 60 meters tall. And the walls were flocked with magnesium crystals. I mean, they were headlamps. It's completely dark, but that the walls sparkled white. And so I had been hearing all these years these details. It's not like I needed a researcher to go into the caves so that I could attribute those experiences of the researcher to Bruno, and rather that after hearing about all of this, it made me have a glimpse of the underground world in a manner that made me curious about it. And I started thinking, like, as a child myself of the 20th century, I was born in 1968, I come out of like the war machine and this idea that moving up toward the sky is the teleological advancement of human life on Earth. That, like, we see up to the skyscraper, and then we see up to the atmosphere, and then, you know, NASA goes beyond the atmosphere, and then you go to the moon, and like the relationship between aerial photography and bombing people, and all of this is about the sky and imagining it's always going up, and then it's going up higher, and then going up beyond that. And I would start hearing just my own son's reports about the underground world and thinking into the down below, and that it subtends the up above, not just physically, but also as an imaginary space that has to do with humans, like who we are and our symbolic world, which is the social world, because it's shared, you know? So I was like thinking about that down into the earth. And then there's this issue in the book about the question of water and the future of water and its use. And just thinking about Bruno down there and hearing from my son about hydrology. Like, you have to be very smart about the water table when you go into these caves, because in some of them, if it rains, you will immediately drown because they fill with water, and he goes through spaces where you have to wade through neck deep water for like a really long way. And so just in being in Bruno, I was thinking, why are they taking the water out of the water table to store it in these huge open plastic lined bays? Like, the the earth is the most ingenious storage facility for water because it filters the water, you know, it keeps it cool. It keeps it in a kind of commons. Like when we hear about the commons, you know, before primitive accumulation, like the idea that people could just share a space for their animals to wander and feed. Like, the water is another kind of commons, and it keeps moving. So that, I guess it was like thinking through his perspective of what it's like to be underground would illuminate his opinions when it comes to whether it's a good idea to take all the water out of the water table and store it someplace else. So I guess like reading things allowed me to sort of build his, I feel like it's like a homemade philosophy, like making a pie crust or something. It's like Bruno's, you know, he goes from one subject to another, and he does speak in a kind of sermonizing format. And I'm very familiar with that format because I spend time with older people who've lived longer than I have, and also, especially like among the people who've lived through these historic kind of gates like May 68, they have knowledge to share, and there's a particular disposition and style of being that I'm familiar with, of men like Bruno, people like that. I mean, she was a bit different and more of, he was easier for me to conjure. And I mean, I borrowed things kind of explicitly that were meant to be familiar, and it would be fine if people recognized the origin, the source. Like with him, there's this memoir by a guy named Jean-Michel Moncion, who was an early associate of Guy Debord. And he didn't write this memoir. It's more like two guys interviewed him and then they transcribed it. And he talks about basically losing his family in World War II. His father was in the resistance, his mother was Jewish, and losing like every member of his family and washing up on the streets of Paris as an orphan. And there were these kids who would hang around with Guy Debord and Michel Bernstein, who came from the orphanages, who were war refugees. And that memoir was always so mysterious to me because it tries to sort of give a glimpse, but it's always through this dark film, this glimpse of what it was like in the 1950s among these people on the left bank who had already decided to kind of leave society. And Guy Debord had made that decision much more intellectually, being a kind of bourgeois who came from a good family and had a fiancé and a car and an apartment, and an education, and was hanging out with kids like Jean-Michel Moncion, who in a way had a form of expertise that Guy Debord hadn't already acquired, which is that there was nothing for him to have to reject because he'd already lost everything and was this sort of like free floating individual, who didn't have to be brave in order to reject bourgeois convention because it wasn't really available to him. And so there's like this exchange of talents, like him teaching Debord about delinquency and not caring. I mean, this is partly me projecting into it, but this memoir had always really meant something to me. And so when I went to make Bruno, he was an amalgamation that felt whole, even as it was borrowed with pieces and parts and ingredients of others. But his philosophy is invented by me, his style of speaking, his outlook.
Is he completely defined before you start writing, or as you're writing, he keeps getting more complicated, and we have to then go back and change things because he has a new complication?
I know what you mean. No, I mean, it's more like I just have to remember what year he was born, But some of the things I added later, it's just more like layers. It's layers. I mean, I sort of had him in opposition with his contemporary Jean Villain, who went to the same area, of the Guyenne. He's also in Vendôme, and I wanted to kind of develop a rivalry between these two men, and that's in part just to further the narrative. But also I was thinking that there's Bruno's way, which is sort of to face the past in order to reckon with the future. And then Jean's way is to go to dairy council meetings and try to help the farmers argue and fight for just a tiny, marginally better share of, commercial farming. So I think it was just bit by bit. But originally, I mean, I'm sorry for the students who are in the class today, this is a repetition, but in terms of the tone, having the two storytellers in one voice, because it's her who's transposing his letters. In the beginning, I was thinking of Sans Soleil by Chris Marker, and the way that the woman says, the first image he told me of was of 3 children on a road in Iceland in 1965, and that beginning to a film where there's a he, but you're not, that person's not going to appear in the film. It's some alter ego for Chris Marker, and it's told in this letter style. I love the formal trick and the ambition of doing that, of having a teller who is telling in this kind of incantatory way where their descriptions are interspersed with he said, he told them, he said, and so I knew that was going to be Bruno. And then I wanted to go longer and longer stretches without her reminding the reader that she's there. And so in some of the deeper biography, like when he's a child and he comes upon the dead Nazi soldier and picks up the helmet and puts it on and gets lice from it, for those who haven't read the book, there's no Bruno said he told them for a long time, because it's almost like you want to pull off the magic trick of having the reader just be up close with him without her in the room. But for her parts, it was more like I wrote the first two lines and I was thinking of that woman with the kind of beautiful English accent. I guess she's French English, who is the narrator of Sans Soleil. But then I quickly realized that Sadie is not this like mellifluous, entrancing woman, and something much more hostile by the way that she would pull back and question Bruno and even be, slightly ridiculing. That evolved more as I was writing, but I had been interested for a long time I guess in a way, yeah. I mean, the idea that these people would work for federal agencies and then lose their jobs when they're found out and end up working in the private sphere to infiltrate leftist environmental activists is like incredible to me. And I always wondered, like, what kind of person does that? And I didn't exactly know the answer, and I may not know the answer still, but Sadie is sort of one version, a rendition of a kind of person like that. And all I knew about her originally was this origin myth of hers, that she worked for the FBI and was getting pressure from her supervisor to produce evidence that these young people in the Bay Area were planning acts of sabotage. And she doesn't find that evidence, and one of them is sweet on her, and so in order to she tells him that they will have a relationship, but as courtship toward that, he is meant to buy 500 pounds of nitrate fertilizer, and she sets him up and entraps him and he goes to prison. So I gave her this origin myth that I sort of took from what happened to a real person, this poor guy Eric McDavid, who was friends of friends, and I had paid attention to that case because it was in my own social life, and also it just seemed deeply unjust. He was charged and sentenced to 21 years in federal prison and served 9 of those years, and then his conviction was completely overturned because he was entrapped. So I took that and gave it to her as an origin myth, and then she kind of developed from there, and I was sort of asking myself, like, how, like, what, I don't know, it's hard for me to retrace my steps, but it was a process of kind of always positioning her like 180 degrees from me. Like something that I would be sympathetic to, I would make her unsympathetic to. Like even down to very small details. Like she regards the vulnerability to mosquito bites as like a moral weakness. And I am one of those people, like if there's a mosquito, I'm the one who'll just be covered with lumps. And so I gave her these forms of sort of hardness and self-assuredness that I don't myself possess. And I found it to be like an interesting exercise for me also, as well as a formal framework for advancing a plot and a narrative, was having a narrator who would walk into a room and think that she can identify weakness in other people. Whereas I'm always trying to figure out, like, what effect am I having on them? And can I modulate my behavior to make them like me a little bit more? And like, she's not like that at all. And so the more she became unlike me, the more my rubric became keep her estranged from you and from what you're like and what you would do. Yes. Oh, and then Nick. Yes. Okay. Sorry.
I was really struck by your conversation and also from what you read about the role of the lunatic. And the lunatic is a very classical hero of a novel. The very first modern novel has a lunatic hero, Don Quixote. And also, the lunatic is also a sort of political hero to a lot of people on the left. Che Guevara and people like that were obsessed with Don Quixote. So I was curious what, returning to the lunatic and at the lunatic literary hero in a strictly political context, like what you were thinking Like, what are you thinking of that archetype, and how do you think it functions in the work?
That's such a brilliant question and a wonderful observation, right, about Don Quixote and Cervantes. And the lunatic, I mean, I was thinking of lunatic as an adjective more than a noun, but I'm comfortable with switching it to a noun as a literary form. But my first instinct is that maybe there's more resonance for me in terms of the contemporary world than there is in terms of the implications of the literary form. But it's both. I guess I would say, I mean, in this particular case with this character Bruno, I think that we are in a pretty lunatic position as inhabitants of the earth, and that thinking our way out of it requires some creativity. And, you know, when he says that we are trapped in a shiny driverless car careening off a cliff, his question is like, how do we exit this car? And that is also my question. And I think that the answer requires, well, like I said, some thinking that isn't, I mean, I don't know how to put it. It's a really good question, so I'm sort of failing to answer it. But I mean, in certain ways, some of what Bruno, some of his thinking is a simplification, or even like a sort of, it's like, it's not grotesque, but there are simplifications along the way, because he's always trying to look, to recalibrate, to locate goodness in people. And I want to do that too. And I think that it's okay to be someone who has always had a very strong hunch that we are meant for something special, like that there is actual meaning to the human project of life on Earth. But there's so much disposability now that like nothing matters, you know, like you could practically just live online. You know what I mean? Like that. I mean that in the sense of like in a dematerialized space where everything is disposable, everything is built to be outmoded and thrown away tomorrow. Ideas as well. I don't know. I think that, I mean, this form you're talking about reminds me of like the position of the fool in a court, you know, or the position of the touched person in different tribal modalities, where there's somebody who both sees less and sees more than other people can. And so they can kind of foretell or indicate salves where other people can't imagine them. And, you know, so maybe that's one way in which the role of the lunatic is still relevant. But like, I mean, we live in a society with so many divisions in it that leave a whole swath of the population out in the cold, in a way, symbolically and literally. And when I think about consensual reality, let's just say like Los Angeles County, you know, I live near downtown in a very urban place. There are people who are not participating in the rules of the society and in that consensual reality. And it's hard not to feel that they know things I don't know and can see things that I can't see. You know, like some people have their wavelength out further than others. And maybe even having your antenna out that far is part of what makes it difficult to play by the rules as they were. I don't know. What do you guys think? No, thank you for that question. Yes, you had a question.
Not really a question, but I really appreciated how I appreciate how you write humor.
Thanks.
You write humor, your voice is very specific. And I know when you're writing, and it's great to read. And so thank you for that. Do you enjoy writing humor?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. Yeah, I mean, I feel like if it's not funny, it's not true for me somehow. It's got to have that edge. Like, I want the sentences to be able to be like I don't know, like glow sticks. You have to be able to crack them open and get some energy inside. Like kind of bringing to the surface of the earth some of the absurdities, but without ever being slapstick or ridiculing, because like it's all very serious also.
Yeah, you write that line, I don't know what it is in another language, but that you do it. And it's
Oh, thank you. That's nice. Yeah, I mean, I want to be funny, just because it's fun. I mean, Sadie, obnoxious. I know James wants to put her in a Foot Locker. My husband feels the same way, but she was a good outlet for certain kinds of humor, because in a way, I mean, some humor does depend upon cruelty. And oversimplification. And so then I kind of have an alibi because she can point these things out that then I can go back to Bruno and retreat and be back with somebody who doesn't see things in such stark terms and isn't interested in humor at the expense of, what might matter to somebody else. Sure. Yes.
At one point, it's a pretty brief mention, I think, but Sadie, or the character we know as Sadie, talks about previously, before becoming an agent and then this sort of like professional infiltrator, she had considered doing a PhD in rhetoric.
Yeah,
And I can't remember if it was specifically at Berkeley, but
it was, but she was in the program.
Oh, okay, and she dropped out.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if you could, it was just so fascinating to me that like there was an alternate path for this character where they could have been an academic or a critical theorist, but this is because in many ways a lot of the ideas that she discusses, especially with the commune and and reading Bruno's emails, they're the same ideas that an academic might think about, but she's grappling with them in such a different context.
Yeah.
She finds the rhetoric people annoying too, right?
She does, yeah. Yes, no, that's a great observation, and it's true. I mean, she has a certain critical aptitude that she's using to make accounts of like what it is these people are pursuing and why they would have a mentor like Bruno, and like is aware that things go from sort of like Maoism to the 1980s. But she's using it just to complete a job to infiltrate this group of anarchists. But yeah, I chose that. Well, I mean, some of these people who've actually done this have been academics. There was a guy in England named Bob Lambert, who was a professor, I think he was a history professor, who, I think he was mentioning this today, but maybe not by name, that he was infiltrating climate activists in England and actually had a child with one of them. And then when that child turned 18, they sued the Metropolitan Police for the ontological predicament of having a fictitious father. It's really heavy. So, it makes sense that some of these people are sort of equipped with a theoretical apparatus and an ability to reproduce a kind of language that would make them a convincing person to come along and attach themselves to a group. I mean, the guy Mark Kennedy, the English guy, who I was mentioning to the students also this afternoon, who infiltrated people in Germany, France, and the UK, and some people that I knew. And I was like, didn't you guys know this guy was a narc? And they said, well, he had a van, he had money. Like, it was like his van worked, in any case, I chose that specifically, in part because, so I went to UC Berkeley, and the rhetoric department was this sort of site of other people's fixations. And it had, like in the 90s, a kind of sophistication to it that extended well beyond like the study of literature into a sort of, having like a flair for politics and yeah. I mean, I wasn't a rhetoric major myself. I studied. Right. Yeah. So, but I didn't really know who those people were at the time. I worked at a bar in Oakland, and our DJ was a grad student in the rhetoric department. And it was like the rhetoric department was the one place where like the grad students would like wear leather jackets, and you would see them at the bar where I worked, And so they had this this reputation for being like a little teeny bit more streetwise than your typical humanities grad student. That's one small part of it, but also just on practical level, I saw her as a polyglot who would go there to be hired as this group's translator. I mean, I'm married to one of this group's translators, so it's like I know that they need translators. And I knew that also that a lot of these people, not just Tarnack, but in Notre Dame de Land and in the Sousa Valley, became very paranoid, and for good reason, after being infiltrated by people. And so I thought she would need to kind of pull off this trick of, connecting to the group. And if she has language skills, then they want her to translate, because everybody wants to be, if you're not writing in the new lingua franca of English, you want your stuff to be translated. The people who are writing in Portuguese and Spanish, and you want to be in conversation, in discourse with other people who share your politics internationally. It's quite important to people. So I knew that they would let her in for that if she was a good translator and you could translate their terms. They have these conversations about puissance, how do you translate puissance, and et cetera. So that's why rhetoric. But then, a couple of months ago, I got an email from a dean at Berkeley who knows my husband from grad school. And she said, do you want to come and give the commencement talk to the rhetoric department this spring? And I said, I would love to do that. It's so coincident, did you notice that it's in the book? And then I haven't heard back from her. So I hope she didn't take offense. We'll see. Anna.
Thanks so much for the reading and for writing the book. I know it's a lot of hard work to write a book, so I really appreciate you.
It was pure fun, honestly.
Yeah. I had a kind of question. I'm not a creative writer, but I'm a student of the novel, both the American novel.
I've heard.
And so, I found this novel very interesting as an American novel that is set in Europe and pretty deeply embedded in the French cultural, political, historical landscape. And I wanted to ask you about, I think I understood this correctly, but there's a writer who has a kind of cameo in your book that I understand is a writer who you don't very much like, and maybe many people in this room don't like either, but it's called Michel Houellebecq.
Oh, I love Houellebecq.
Okay.
He's one of my favorite writers.
Am I wrong about that he shows up in the book?
Yeah, he does. He has a cameo.
Not in a very positive way. And of course, he is a writer, I think, who has been interested in some of these agricultural issues that you're also interested in writing about in the book. Except he's very much on the political right, and his writing, well, it seems to me at least, right, Trump supporter, certainly. Some of his writings have been recuperated by the alt-right and used by the alt-right to discuss in those terms. Why did you decide to give him a cameo in the book? Is it the gesture of adoration if you love him as a writer?
Love is a strong word, but
inscribing yourself politically in this kind of French landscape and set of issues where you're setting up a difference between the alt-right appropriation of these issues and a kind of more leftist way of writing about that politically? What was the purpose of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for pointing that out and asking. Yeah, so a few things. I do like his novel, Serotonin. I mean, there are aspects of it that
That's what I was thinking
of course, yeah. He's researching it in this book.
Right.
So, but I do like that novel, and I think that with Houellebecq, I still think some of the novels are interesting. I'm not interested in his political viewpoints, I tried to read the book of his conversations with Bernard-Henri Lévy, and it's it's supposed to be positioned like one of them is on the right and the other one isn't, and they're just, the level of discourse is very low and very banal and not interesting. And this tends to be the case with people who, Houellebecq wants to make himself into a true spectacle. He's always at the site of chaos. But he also just has a knack for it. He was at the Charlie Hebdo offices the morning of the assassination, and his face was on the cover of their next issue. And he'd just written Submission, which is a pretty interesting novel. if you read that novel for itself and not for what Welbeck thinks it is or wants it to be secretly, like if you read interviews with him, then you have to pull back and go, wait a minute, what did I just read? But when I'm reading that novel, I see, so Submission, if you haven't read it, is, well, I don't want to get too far into it, but involves questions about the future of France and the Muslim population. And at the end of the novel, this academic has accepted that the president of France has turned France into Sharia law, right? And he converts to the Muslim faith, and he goes through this ritual. And probably there are people who are thinking like, oh, this is like this horror ending. And I thought like, this is the most moving ending. It was so incredible. And you could tell that there's a part of Welbeck that read the Quran and longs to have a religious identitarian attachment to something so consuming as he imagines that could be, because he's the product of this alienated consumer society, and he makes fun of the version of France where people just shop at Carrefour and go to Mr. Bricolage and have no real culture as such, which leads to fascist longings, right, and identitarian longings, and et cetera. But anyway, we could talk about that for too long, and I'm not really like equipped to do it because I'm not that interested in that part of Welbeck. But he wrote Serotonin and published it while I was still trying to write this book, and so I was reading it thinking like, trying to write this book which heavily involves, a key showdown between dairy farmers in the French state. And now Welbeck just wrote a novel which includes a key showdown between dairy farmers in the French state. And I was talking to an Irish friend of mine, this writer Rob Doyle, about it, and he goes, well, just put him in the book. And I realized he would be researching that book. I mean, Welbeck doesn't really need to research because he worked as an agronomist before he became a novelist. But in my fictionalized version, where I used his birth name, Michel Thomas, which that's the name on his birth certificate, he changed it to Welbeck. I used that name and I made it like, he's going to the agricultural fair because he's buddies with this sub-minister who's also based on a real person. It's Manuel Valls. But Manuel Valls was the prime minister of France, and I didn't think I had it in me to knock off a prime minister. So I heavily demoted him to deputy sub-minister of this ministry that doesn't exist, of the Ministry of Rural Coherence, which might as well exist, because that's like what a lot of these rural projects are about in France, is bringing things into the round for the uses of, big industrial farming concerns. So I thought, he'll be with the deputy sub-minister and they'll show up at the agricultural fair. And then my version of Welbeck will sort of keep his appointment with history, which he's been so good at doing all along. And yet once more, there he is at the site of the melee, and he gets a black eye, and he can go on TV and talk about it. And then it turned out that Welbeck is really good friends with the minister, Bruno Le Maire, the finance minister, who wrote that new novel about annihilation. I haven't read that yet. But it's a cameo, it's a small part of the book. And when I turned it into my American editor, she goes, does this guy have to be here? Like, she really didn't like him. But so I made it like a little bit smaller. And it hasn't come out yet in France. I just saw the translation. Not that I'm in a position to really judge a translation. You have to know the language so well, to hear like how it hears to French people, to native speakers. But it's coming out there in January. And not about the Welbeck part, but it'll just be interesting to see what the reception is there. Because as you point out, it does engage deeply with France and French politics. And I was relieved that my French editor really likes the book and they're behind it. We'll see. On verra. Any other questions? Or should we segue to the...
There's a reception afterwards, outside.
I heard. Yeah. Unless anybody has a final thing. Such great questions. Thank you all so much. Are you waiting on this?
I'm not, yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to get it out of your way.
Thanks.
Yep.
Good to see you too. Asking me like, have you set up a meeting with Dr.